Hello and welcome back to the PSYCLab. All right, we're going to do chapter 14. Today we're going to deal with some intense issues around intimacy and isolation and how huge that is to young adulthood, and could there be a more pressing time to talk about the importance of psychological intimacy and some of the costs of psychological isolation and what we can do about it, and how we can use some of these ideas from psychology to actually help us better navigate this current situation that we're in. Next slide. So again, this chapter 14, social and personality development in early adulthood. Okay, so the last lecture I did, we were looking at adolescence and the teenage years, and now we're looking at early adulthood and kind of the 20s, 30s. Okay, but again, like this stuff still applies if you're in your late teens, and this stuff still applies if you're in your 40s and 50s. It's just a lot of these ideas are that there's these moments in our life where certain things are kind of more centralized, or these kind of, the language we'd use in this course is these key developmental tasks that we need, these or stages, these ages and these stages, and that it's like all these things. Like last week we talked about identity. It's not like identity doesn't matter when you're an adult, but it's the emphasis, right? It's like there are these kind of key tasks of the moment or of the age or of the stage that we're at. And last week was identity, and this week is intimacy. So this brings us to Erikson, right? And we've talked about the psychoanalyst Erik Erikson throughout this course, and I think it's interesting to think that at this time he's basically saying at a lot of the stages of life that you guys are at, you're being challenged with this idea of who are you, and that's what we were focusing on more last week, but also how are you going to fit in socially with things. And immediately in that picture kind of implies, like, immediately when we think of intimacy, we think of romantic relationships, but that's not all that's meant by that. And intimacy means kind of this ability to form relationships that are of a certain level of emotional depth and connectedness, but without losing ourselves. And we'll see this in this definition here, right? So Erikson defines it as a capacity to engage in supportive, affectionate, and kind of like emotionally filled relationship without losing a sense of self, without drowning in the other person. Because remember last week we talked about how a key thing in developing psychological health is the establishment of identity. Sorry if my hand gestures look weird. I can see myself, and it's the flip of what I think it's going to be, so it's all messed. There's a classic Mike talking about stuff that should just be an internal thought. Okay, but this ability to basically, can you have a deep, meaningful relationship with another person and still be true to yourself and still be without losing your own sense of self, right? You may as well just use his words. He says it very distinctly, right? So Erikson's saying at this stage of life, this is the key developmental task, is to try to establish intimacy. And this is so much more relevant today, where we're all craving intimacy, and it's not, and there's an element of this obviously has a romantic love component, but there's also a friendship component, a family component, when you have your own children, when you're on teams, when you're a part of a religious organization, when you're a part of a school class. It's like we are social creatures that benefit psychologically from being engaged with other people. So much so that Erikson said that that's actually the key developmental task in your early adulthood, is establishing how that's going to work. And, Erikson never heard of the coronavirus. It's like, think of how much, but remember, this has nothing to do necessarily with physical distance. This is a psycho-emotional concept. This is a psychological and emotional and social and relational intimacy. And why what I'm saying is just that, like, understand the kind of and you understand and me understand. It's not like I'm preaching down at you. It's like, this is just as important to me to realize, like, I need to call my parents. I need to call my brother and sister. I need to reach out to my friends, and that's what keeps us strong. We have to protect our crew. That's in our genetics. You know, and if you're in an isolated scenario where you don't feel like you have an immediate crew, it's like, man, the amount of digital options available to try to connect with people or try to help out or try to reach out to situations and become someone else's crew, you know, become an asset and a support person for someone else. You know, become part of the solution, become a strength in the system. Just as I said, I hear the loud themes, music from Little Mermaid come from upstairs. But yeah, I'm trying to get my daughter to watch Little Mermaid for a bit so I can rip through some slides from my students who I miss like crazy. This is crazy. I'm trying to do this digitally, and we'll get through this, okay? One slide at a time, one day at a time, one everything at a time. Next. So then Erickson's warning was that if we failed to develop, you know, relationships of intimacy, that it could lead to the feeling of psychological isolation. And again, remember, we're not necessarily talking here about being with or without people literally physically around us. We're talking about our level of psychological and emotional and relational depth, right? So Erickson says here that isolation results from relationships that are inadequate, that lack self-disclosure, so that lack truthful sharing, and that, you know, involve unresolved identity crises. It's kind of harsh, right? But it links back to the last stage and says, like, well, some of this is carryover from the identity formation process. Some of this is issues with being able to, but notice in that definition, it doesn't say not having people around you. It's having psychological, emotional, social relationships that lack or that are inadequate. It's the psychological experience of isolation. Okay, this next concept, let's focus on this word for a sec, right? What does emerging mean? Emerging means to become or to emerge, to grow into. And Arnett has this idea that he said, that is that it might be helpful to look at this kind of in-between stage between adolescence and adulthood. That some of you would fall into age-wise right now, like this 17 to 22, and like the age range is somewhat, you know, that could be even into the later into the 20s, right? And people are in this kind of interesting life space where they're experimenting with adult options, whether we're talking about, like, you know, maybe living with someone for the first time, maybe moving away to school for the first time, maybe you know, moving out of the parents, maybe moving out of your hometown, all these very adult things, but you still might only be like 18, and 2 years ago we considered you a teenager. So it's almost like this in between emerging stage, emerging adulthood. Okay, that's a term definitely to know for the test. Emerging adulthood. It emerges, right? You need to address things like, you know, and you guys are in a program right now focused heavily on what are you going to do after this? What's your next step academically and work-wise, right? And how does that relate to things like your conduct or your behavior? And then obviously other important social things like friendships and romance, right? But then at the same time, we know that the part of the brain that governs impulse control in certain aspects of decision making is not fully matured. So the conflict there is that you're in the stage of life where you're being asked to make all these super important, highly consequential long-term decisions when you're not as good as you'll be later at weighing risk and long-term consequence. So obviously it's a stressful time of life for just that point alone. I wanted to take a second here with this slide to look at this difference between what developmental and what evolutionary psychology, what those two fields of study represent and how they complement each other. And developmental psychology, I'll just read this quick, is a scientific approach that aims to explain how kids and adults change over time. Right, so in this course, we're really looking at how you as an individual, but people in general, change from when they're kids to when they're adults. Okay, a significant proportion or a significant amount of the theories within this discipline, within developmental psych, are focused on development during childhood, as this is the period when an individual's lifespan experiences the most amount of change. So much is happening during childhood that there's a huge focus in developmental psych on those early years. Okay, but developmental psychology is still only looking at what we see. So if we see like, okay, kids start to crawl at a certain age, or they start to talk at a certain age, or people start to go to puberty at a certain age, developmental psychology is looking at hundreds of thousands or millions or whatever people and trying to find when the averages are. Okay, but within one lifespan. Okay, just one sec. So then, sorry, Evie kind of crashed that last one, so I wrapped it up quick so I could save what I had. But the point I was making, because I saved this kind of slide by slide, but the point I was making was that evolutionary psychology, developmental psychology is looking at the changes that happen within an organism within one lifespan, right? Human, cradle to grave. Whereas evolutionary psychology is looking at an organism or a species over countless generations, right? So development is like within one lifespan, evolution is across multiple generational lifespans. But they're both looking at how change occurs, how we develop and how we evolve. Evolutionary psychology is a theoretical approach to psychology that attempts to explain useful mental and psychological traits, such as like why we use memory the way we do, why we perceive things we do, whether we're talking about visual or whatever, why we use language the way we do, and looking at those things as adaptations, right, or natural selection related. They helped our ancestors survive, and that's why they're hardwired the way they are. So evolutionary psychology is trying to answer the why to the developmental psychology what. Next slide. Okay, so this is one where you guys are going to definitely have some follow-up points to make and questions, which is awesome, but evolutionary psychology suggests that our evolution as a species has a huge effect on how we approach things like mate selection or dating or sexual selection, way more than we think. And that it's basically linked to these two ideas, fertility and security. Okay? And that this has a long evolutionary basis. When we ask people, and that this selective process of mating has had a huge effect on which of our ancestors survived and which didn't. Cross-cultural studies suggest that men prefer physically attractive younger women, men lower their standards based on availability, is a nice way of saying it. Women tend to prefer men who have a higher socioeconomic status than their own, tend to. Remember, these are on averages. There's tons of examples that go against it. But this again isn't my opinion. This is when you ask people. So remember, developmental psychology is looking at what people do on average. It's not about what should or could. It's about what we see when we examine people's lived experience. So they take this another step, and I switched to lions. We're talking about lions now, so people can't get upset. We're not talking about human beings. We're talking about lions. All right, and that lions have different amount of investment, whether we're talking about the male or the female. That men value health and availability in mates. Men tend to be less selective because of the minimal investment in conceiving or bearing offspring. I'll keep this super technical. Women's investment starts with a 9-month commitment in giving birth. That's actually a human stat, obviously. Men seek to maximize the number of their offspring, while women seek to minimize the number of their offspring. Now, that's not seek to minimize, meaning minimize within one family. Again, this is saying what evolution would suggest would happen. That because there's different investment levels from the two parents, that would actually affect behavior. Now, the basic point here is that there's different things there's different levels of investment by each parent, and that's shaping behavior. Again, this is what evolutionary psychology would suggest about why certain people select certain other people. Okay, now in some of the follow-up slides, we're going to see some counterpoints to that. Okay, but this is a very biological, very evolutionary interpretation of it. Well, it's just a piece of the puzzle. It's definitely a part of it. Now, what I was saying on the last few slides was if we're starting with this nature nurture thing that we talk about all the time in class, it was more of a nature side of the argument, whereas now we're going to talk more about a nurture side, this idea of social role theory that actually ever since people are born, they're being, whether we're talking about the Disney movies you watch, you're being told what the role of the woman is and what the role of the man is, and that these different roles are actually, think of what that word role means. It's like if you were going to play that role in a movie, you would know that certain things are associated with this role and with that role, and that we actually learn that. Again, it's a nurture side of the debate. That sex differences or differences between men and women are adaptations to gender roles, resulting from present day social realities rather than natural selection. Again, you've been in my classes, you know my point on all this, that it's some complicated combination. Of course, your genetics and your evolutionary history affects who you are, probably way more than we'd like to think. But at the same time, of course, you're shaped by your society and what you're told is normal ever since you're a kid. So it's a false dichotomy to think it's one or the other. It's not one or it's not this or that. It's a complicated complexity. And the point against that is that higher income earning women still seem to select higher income earning men. So even women that make a lot of money tend to still seek men that, whether aware of or not, right? And they ask this by asking them what they're attracted to on like survey research. They find that idea of aiming up economically is still true at that level, which if social role theory is completely true, it's a counterpoint, right? Again, you might want to start this slide. We might want to talk about this slide more on our Zoom meeting Friday. Again, sorry if you can hear Evie in the background, but she's being pretty good and she's just kind of singing to herself while playing with dolls. I don't even know if the mic's picking that up, but I'm so much closer to the mic. Hopefully it's just a little bit of background distortion. Okay, next slide. So this is kind of interesting. So we're going to talk about relationships a bit here. And we're going to start with marriage. What do you always hear about marriage? You always hear like 50% of marriages end in divorce. Now that stat is highly loaded and misleading. Longitudinal research, which means research done over long periods of time, suggests that most marriages actually endure, and that if people stay married for the first 8 years, the chances of them getting divorced actually dips below 1%. So that's highly significant, right? A lot of marriages that don't work out early, statistically. We know that married adults report higher levels of, happiness, tend to be healthier, tend to literally live longer, tend to have less psychiatric disturbance. Life is tough. Having someone to go to battle with you is important. Not that you all have to get married, but there's a reason why it's associated with certain psychological benefits. So what influences marital success? Speaking as an expert, someone with a perfect marriage who's never had a single fight and who does everything perfect. If you stopped laughing, I'll keep going. No, I was like, of course, any kind of long-term relationship takes work, and especially a marriage. And I think that's also the benefit of it. That's why it gets strong, because of the build, because of the constructive effort, maybe we'll say. All right, values are important, that the people in the relationship have at least compatible values. They don't have to think the same on everything. And notice values is a very different word than interests. I think me and my wife have very similar values. What's at the core important to us, like family and certain things, but our interests are completely different. Right, I'm downstairs here in the basement doing this YouTube podcast with Bruce Lee and the Raptors behind me. I think she's upstairs watching like Grey's Anatomy and knitting. It's like, or doing a puzzle. We're completely different at an interest level, but not at a values level. Another big impact on long-term marital success is levels of neuroticism, right? So remember, neuroticism means the tendency towards a lot of negative emotionality. It can be dissatisfying for the other partner, which is, sort of self-explanatory. Now, this is really an important point. Attitudes towards divorce actually have a huge impact on divorce rates, which means if you and your partner view getting divorced as not that big of a thing, you're actually more likely to get divorced. Couples unopposed to divorce report, and not only that, you're actually more likely to view your relationship negatively. If you view it as something that you're potentially at some point going to get out of, then the tendency to be critical of it increases. That's a valuable insight from developmental psych. So now check out this slide. So this is just some quick stats, and these are American stats, but look at this. So people that are married without children under 18, I'll start with the yellow, orange, and then we'll work left and around. That's 28%. Single people living alone, about another 30%. Married people with children under 18, about 20%. Single women with children under 18, about 14%, whatever. Single men with children under 18, 5%. Opposite sex cohabitating couples, so a man and a woman living together for an extended period of time in a relationship but not married, about 5%, and then same-sex couples around 1%. So this is just kind of some demographic information is what it's called, just some interesting stats. Okay, so this next concept's one I definitely want you to know for the test, and it's Robert Sternberg. His idea is that love, again, it seems weird talking about without sounding corny, but it's so central to all of our lives, that what he called true love, or what he called like the kind of relationship that at least theoretically a lot of us are aspiring to, is kind of composed of these three key components. Okay, the first one being intimacy, right? So feelings that promote closeness and connectedness, and this is very psychological, emotional. Now, obviously, there's hormonal intimacy pieces, but he's talking about this connection, closeness and connection. The next piece he says is the passion, right? So this is like the romance, the feelings of intense longing for union with the other person, including sexual union. So there's the passion piece, right? And then the third piece is the commitment piece, right? So what he's kind of saying is that you could score each relationship on these three things, and that these are three components to relationship quality. Okay, so remember Steinberg's three components of relationship quality: intimacy, passion, commitment. So then if you look at, so this is his model, right? So he's saying consummate love. So if you look in the middle of that diagram, that's the word that you'll need to know for the test. All right, he talks about consummate, and consummate means everything brought together. So obviously consummate love there is when it's like what he's saying is the most ideal, when you have that combination of intimacy and psychological connection plus the passion plus the long-term commitment. He calls that consummate love, full true love, right? But then he says like all these other kinds of relationships exist. You can have a scenario where there's a lot of the commitment and a lot of the intimacy, but not a lot of the passion, and that's almost more like companion or friend love. And you can have like just the passion, you can have just the intimacy or liking, you can have just the commitment, or what he called empty love. You can have what he called romantic love, which is when there's the intimacy and the passion, but maybe not the commitment. Or maybe there's the commitment and the passion, but not the intimacy, which he called fascist love, or just fake love. It's an interesting thought that at the core of a lot of relationships is this idea of like, is there intimacy? Is there passion? Is there commitment? It's interesting doing this presentation on marriage. Right, I'm like 6 years in, going on 7 years in, and coronavirus quarantine is obviously an interesting time for everybody in every type of relationship, really, even single. So I guess there's nothing uniquely special about me, but it is a different context when you're around each other 24/7 constantly, especially when you have a kid like ours. That's an amazing kid, but does not sleep. But if you can hear, you can't hear her anymore because she is, I think, at least hopefully sleeping for now. So I'm going to try to finish this presentation before our night erupts, because she sometimes wakes up around 2, but that has nothing to do with the current slide, and I will keep on going, because how you handle stuff, how you validate each other. If my wife has a good idea and I'm like, do I build on that or do I criticize every single time? Right? So if I'm in class and I'm like making some big point about something and you're sitting there and you're kind of head nodding, or you're like, like you're kind of validating, you're kind of like, validating means kind of like adding credit to, adding validity to, adding validness to. Right, so we said these couples can fight even sometimes often, but they try to do their best at not letting it escalate too much. That's such good advice, because it's really saying like even the most successful couples have the potential to go there and have crazy fights all the time. But it's that not letting it escalate. It's that maintaining a base level of respect and listening to each other, keeping the communication channels open. Notice it's not a lack of conflict. What is referred to in the literature as volatile. So think of volatile as like you put a couple of chemicals into a scientific petri, what's that called? A beaker, and then it like explodes. You'd say those chemicals were volatile, explosive. It's like sometimes you have these couples that fight a lot, don't really listen well, but if there's enough positive, right, oftentimes with things like humor, and the positive outweighs the negative, these couples actually tend to stay together. Right, so the important point here is that even couples that argue a lot can stay together. What's important is how they argue and how it's offset by other stuff. Within reason, obviously. There's obviously extreme examples of all this stuff. What the literature is very clear about is that once couples start avoiding, minimizing conflict, not engaging, and this is another important lesson for all of us, starting to agree to disagree, starting to devitalize, right? Like almost just not caring, that's associated with diminished relationship quality, obviously. So it's like it's better to be, and this is tough advice because sometimes it's way easier to avoid things. But and I'm not saying like if you're early in a relationship that you have to bring up every negative thing and work through everything immediately. It's like some of these things kind of evolve over years. This goes better as a conversation. I'm trying to, usually this is a hotly debated slide. So yeah, so if you guys have questions about this, let me know. We're not debated, but usually we talk a lot about this. So the research relating to divorce is also quite clear. The couples that are most likely to divorce are when there's a lot of the negative with not a lot of balancing, not a lot of positive to outweigh the negative. when there's a lot of the hostility and then a lot of detachment. Now, again, a lot of relationships, even very healthy relationships, will have aspects of this at times. This is like when it gets to the point of how it would typify or how it would be known as like the tendency or the continual pattern of the relationship if it's hostile and detached. Fighting regularly, rarely making eye contact, the lack of affection and support. Again, if you're mad at your boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever now, you're probably doing those things. You're not making as much eye contact, you're not as responding as directly to things they say, but that can be situational in almost all relationships. It's when it becomes this kind of definitional tendency. Okay, divorce is associated with all kinds of drama. Everything from being distracted and being more likely to get into, excuse me, automobile accidents to, extreme things like deep depression and suicide to like missing days at work, across all kinds of health and lifestyle outcomes. It tends to be associated with all kinds of stuff, obviously. Divorce is a big deal that affects a lot of things. Again, I don't think any of this is shocking information to you. It'd be more shocking if I was saying that there's no psychological effect of divorce. Right? Of course there is. Now, that's not saying that people can't rebound or whatever, but it is saying that the literature is pretty clear. And if you want more information, I highly recommend reading this chapter, reading chapter 14. It's really solid. Even if you come back to it and go deep into it in the future, in the summer or something. Because this is the chapter that probably has the most direct personal significance to your life. Okay, next slide. Now, oftentimes divorce is associated with serious economic hardship, especially for women, and this is just statistics again, and especially if the woman is not working or not in a high income job herself and doesn't have a lot of schooling. In the short term, it can actually improve the economic situation for men, which is fool's gold though, because it's like so much of your life there's so much to your life besides just economics. But maybe you have a bit more disposable income, but again, this is situational. But statistically, it does seem to, at least in the short term, improve their economics. But again, that's a very compartmentalized way of looking at it. Divorced women, though, have up to a 50% decline in income. Right, hardest on working class women with the lowest education, which kind of makes sense. It's like the better your job, the less you're like if you're a woman with a high earning job, it's a different story than if you're a woman with a low earning job. Same for men. Which is kind of stating the obvious, but it is very interesting to look at the statistical evidence that says that men seem to almost improve a little bit in the short term and women tend to go down almost 50%. Now again, that's not a fair comparison because you're comparing on one variable when a lot of variables affect those one variables on both sides. So it's you're not comparing apples to apples here, but it's just an interesting point of discussion. This point usually gets a fiery discussion going. Do you think people that live together before they get married are more likely to stay together long term or less? Because the research actually suggests less. What? Oh, that was lame how I did that, but whatever. Right? This is usually where students are like, well, that doesn't make any sense, because you'd think that like living with people before you get married, you'd get to learn about each other, you'd get to like, and that's true. And that's why it does work for some people. But what the research says in general is that when people that live together before marriage on average are less satisfied with marriage, are more likely to divorce. And one of the reasons is that the literature suggests, anyways, again, remember, this isn't like my opinion, this is a reflection on what chapter 14 is suggesting, that a lot of this is because if you're not living together before you get married and then you get married, there's so much change that happens in that first little bit that you might actually mold and change together better. Now, I've only got married once, and so I don't have a counter situation, but me and my wife didn't live together before we got married, and so there was a lot of change, a lot of even simple things like she hates when I leave my socks around or stuff like that, right? It's like everybody has their few things, and you kind of learn how to adapt and live with each other. So the point here is that couples who live together, are less similar in that behavior. Okay, now, and we'll get more into this, but an important distinction here is this point only kind of makes sense. You almost have to make one more split in the sample, because when you're looking at a couple that say is living together, so say two people are living together, they've been living together and in a relationship for the last 6 years, they plan to get married maybe in the future, or maybe not even necessarily married, but they want to be together long term, they have that psychological, emotional, relational, long-term commitment, then they're known less likely to get divorced or whatever if they do get married. So the variable here is less about, basically what it's saying there is, if you're going to run this statistic and you're going to compare couples that were living together before marriage with ones that aren't, you have to realize that the couples living together, there's kind of two groups. And this is true for all of you, right? It's like some of you are maybe in a more casual, newer relationship, or you might even be living with the person, but it's more, the long-term commitment's a little bit less articulated, right? But some of you might be in situations where it is very articulated and it's very clear. And the psychological literature would suggest that those are very different situations, right? Because if you go back to the three variables we talked about before, love, passion, and intimacy, intimacy, passion, and commitment, the commitment variable is what you're adjusting between those two types of cohabitating couples. I hope that rant made sense. Okay, next slide. Basically saying everybody that is living together but not married aren't the same, that there's differences, and that the biggest significance difference is level of commitment to long-term togetherness. I think we made it through that one. Next slide. And instead of rambling forever, I could have just come to this next slide that actually says it pretty clear. Another big reason is that when you're with somebody and you're planning on being with them long-term, even if you're, right, so I have here like people that are living together long-term and intending to marry, or at least, remember, the legal marriage isn't as important here as the psychological commitment or the spiritual commitment. That people that are intending to marry tend to share workload at home better, tend to be more happy. So they basically tend to work together better. They tend to be more happy in their relationship status, or in their level of relationship satisfaction score during the time that they're living with someone else. And they tend to be better communicators. So what's that saying? That's saying if you take a bunch of people, right, and you say you do a study and you're like, okay, we're going to, for the study, interview only people that are not married but living with the person they're dating. And then as soon as they come in the door for the study, you say, okay, well, one way that we're separating the groups is, do you have, this would be such an awkward way to start it, right? If it's strangers, do you guys have any plans to get married? We'll just ask a super personal first question. But if theoretically you did that and then you made two categories, one group that did and one that didn't, you'd see these, on average, these key differences in how the behavioral aspect of the relationship and the psychological kind of emotional aspect of the relationship plays out. Again, maybe we'll just bring up cohabitation next class on Zoom, because I think I answer this question better in exchange with students when you guys are hitting me with questions about this. So if you have questions, let me know, and I'll respond to them live in our Zoom. Okay, next slide. Now, a lot of the research on relationship quality in the developmental psychology literature has been done in heterosexual relationships, at least historically. Now that's certainly changing. Some of the earlier research on this has looked at how attachment security is still a very important factor in gay and lesbian relationships. Okay, so just as early attachment scores were predictive of long-term relationship stability in heterosexual couples, that seems to be consistent in gay and lesbian couples, which is predictable. They're human beings in human relationships, obviously. There's going to be that consistency in how early relationships affect later relationships. Partners sharing similar backgrounds and equally committed to relationship length report highest levels of satisfaction. Again, that's not necessarily unique to this subgroup, but it's an interesting finding, right? So again, when we're looking at this kind of information, this would be based on self-reported questionnaire data, right? People commenting on their own relationship. So again, it's not like my opinion on these things. It is what is reported as in developmental psych, what the average scores are, what the norms are. Now, one unique thing that is very clear in the literature is this idea of how the amount of emotional support that gay and lesbian partners get from each other is super important. And it sometimes relates to this idea of family of choice. And I think that this, especially historically, has been a huge issue. If someone comes out and their family's not supportive about it, and it creates tension, and they, maybe have to move to a bigger city where there's more when isolation from the original family happens, sometimes people build families of choice. Okay, which is a term used in developmental psych to basically mean when your friends become your family. And it makes sense if somebody is kind of turned away from their family. Now, I'm hoping that in 2020, this is less of a thing. I'm sure it's still a thing somewhere, depending on where in the world people are and what people's parents are like. Again, in terms of how much people share tasks, so what that basically means is like how much people share chores, which in general is associated with relationship stability because no one wants to be the one always doing all the annoying chores. Now, this sharing of chores seems to be more true in lesbian couples than gay couples. I have no rationale for why that would be the case. That's just kind of an interesting point. Okay, now focusing on either heterosexual or homosexual couples is kind of making the assumption that relationship is better than not relationship. And I think there is some interesting points around the idea of singlehood, or that some adults, even if only for a period of time, prefer singlehood as actually a preference. When you're single, it is associated with greater autonomy, right? Greater ability to like do whatever you want and greater ability for personal growth or stuff like that. But again, all these benefits have costs. When I say that all the benefits have costs, it's like I like to show this picture of my old house's backyard, right? And you can see if you look close in the kind of top there, top left, you can see my hammock between the two trees. And when it was like a nice full spring day, when the trees were in full bloom, it was just like a perfect green canopy above of the lightest green, and you could just lay there, and it was, part of me wishes I could go back to like, well, not even wishes, but when I was living there before Evelyn, things were easier. Now, I wouldn't give up Evelyn for the world, so it's kind of just a theoretical mind trip, but there's no doubt about the fact that well, just I would be done all of these presentations already if I was living at home by myself. But then again, there's costs. Um, there's costs to a lack of relationship. So, so again, where we get into trouble is where we focus on single factors as if those are the only things that bring happiness, when happiness is a multi-factored variable. Okay. Many adults participate in intimate relationships that don't involve cohabitating or marriage. Right, so you might be in this situation where you've been dating someone for a long time. There's not specific plans for marriage, but and you're not living together. But you're definitely not. Sorry, now if you haven't noticed, there's been some time delay. I started this presentation like afternoon, and then I did a bit with Evie here when she was getting ready for bed, and then now she's sleeping. So this is the late night shift. Get through the last 20 slides. All right, and we just kind of refer to those people as having a partner. You know, it's not super technical language. Close relationships with family are for these people still in super important places of support, with close friends playing a prominent kind of key role in the social network. So do you think men or women are more statistically likely to want to be a parent? Oh, a trick question. You all said women. Well, we know about 90% of women either are or would like to be a parent at some point in their life. However, the statistics actually suggest that more men, more than 90% of men, say that they could see themselves being a father. And there's usually some interesting discussion around this. And part of the rationale might be that for some women that don't see themselves as being a mother, that's a very strong choice, where it seems like a lot of men are more, well, of the mindset that if the right situation came along, they'd be open to it. So again, when I'm saying more men than women, remember I'm still saying the women number is 90% or more. So that's actually saying that most people, over 90% of people in general, say that in like the right situation, they could see themselves as being a parent. It's also interesting to think that fathers start to emotionally attach to newborn children, start to actually form a biochemical bond even before the child's born, right? So this is kind of counter to the old idea that like the stone cold dad. It's like actually there starts to become a biochemical reaction early. You know, I forgot this slide was in here. A beautiful little girl who's been such a pain sleeping this week. She's just been brutal at sleeping this week. Has been like having these hour long, I think she's having nightmares. So we tried a new strategy for putting her to sleep really calmly tonight, and we'll see if it works. It's about 12 now, so usually happens around 2, but we're gonna bring her into bed with us and hopefully catch it before it starts. But again, it's like I wouldn't give her up for anything. That even just that face has so much personality. And I know I'm like bragging about my own kid, but sometimes you got to reflect and take some inventory on yourself and count your blessings and not just focus on the things that you wish were a little bit different. Because, well, again, just in general, kids make you talk more like this in general, and that's kind of my point here. Okay. The transition to parenthood. Now I only have one child, one daughter, who's now 3. So I know a lot about the transition from no kids to one. I hear no kids to one and 2 to 3 are the biggest transitions. I don't know. I think every transition is a big one. But this idea that even emotionally healthy moms and dads need to adapt to parenthood. That's an important lesson, and what that's kind of saying is like it doesn't matter who you are. Like being a parent is a major change, and if you experience some challenges, it's part of the course. You know, it's you're not weird. New parents may argue about caretaking duties. To put it lightly, it's like everybody's fine with changing the diaper, but nobody wants to change it at 3:30 in the morning for that 8th night in a row. Again, that ties to sleep deprived, as you can probably see under my eyes. I know I'm like, whatever, man. Just coronavirus time. We just gotta fight and be warrior minded and not be weak about, well, who cares? Oh my, I could be prettier. It's like, man, I got a old man mug already. It is what it is. Less time for things like conversation, sex, which Freudian slip that's bolded, simple affection, routine chores, extended family, cultural rituals can be important things in easing this transition a bit. Right, and I know that having my mom and Julie's mom and Julie's family and my family being like really supportive, especially early on, especially around things like helping us get a bit of extra sleep. It's amazing how much like one night of even decent sleep can completely change you from thinking like that you're overwhelmed to that you're capable. And you are capable. It's like we just are weak when we're tired. Mentally weak, willpower weak. Willpower and mental toughness takes energy. So postpartum depression, just a quick side note, I love talking to you guys. This is, I miss this. I get a lot from, I don't mean I get a lot, that sounds so selfish, but it's, I get a lot of, well, I get a lot of meaningful exchange from you guys, and I miss that. Postpartum depression too, this is like another one of those things, it's a lot more, it feels a lot more meaningful talking about in person because it's such a real thing. It's like this idea that you can get, a woman has the child and it's like supposed to be the best part day of their life, and they're experiencing emotions that don't match that. And I think it's really important to realize that this is very biochemical. It's not about you not loving your kid. It's about the fact that your body just went through, and I'm saying not you, the people in the situation's body went through a massive biochemical, physical process, emotional. And the body can take a long time to stabilize, and it can be very disorienting. But it's very common, and we're going to talk about it for a bit here. So, although everyone can get sadness around this and periods of it, because again, like, um, I've obviously never given birth. I've been in the birthing room once with my wife, obviously. And again, like I've talked about this in class, that it's was definitely on my top couple most intense things I've ever been through. And if you've been in that situation yourself, as well as the person giving birth, more so, obviously, it's just it's one of those things that is so incredibly amazing, but so common that it's easy to underestimate just how profound of a thing it is, and then how big of an impact and event it is for your body. And so the fact that it might disturb us at a hormonal, emotional, biochemical level, at least for a short time, is not like crazy surprising. Actually, 10 to 25% of new mothers experience this. Right, so that's a huge statistic. That's as high as a quarter of people, of moms. Right, and nowadays, even when my wife had the baby, I remember the nurse bringing it up, like things to look for, and because it's just like it can happen to anybody. There's a high biochemical component. We're going to look at some of this stuff here. Okay, so this could be feelings of sadness, profound sadness, overwhelming sadness that lasts for several weeks. Now, here's an interesting piece. and we're going to talk kind of nature and nurture. Sorry, I paused there. I thought I heard her crying, but I didn't. So if a woman has had a lot of steroid hormone late in pregnancy, it increases the likelihood of postpartum depression, which is very interesting because that's like a very biological, physical reason. Also, though, unplanned pregnancies can increase the risk of postpartum depression, which is also interesting because that's way more of a nurture kind of thing, right? Like, so you'd have to think in general. In general, an unplanned pregnancy is probably more stressful than a planned pregnancy, like all other things considered equal. So stress levels definitely have an effect. Right? The presence of major stress level factors was my next point. Presence of major life stressors increases risk. And then what I really want you to know for the test, and a really important thing to know just in life in general, is that women that are experiencing depression during their pregnancy, that's the single biggest predictive factor. Right? So for a woman that's experiencing a lot of depression during pregnancy, you would be on the look for warning signs of postpartum depression. So the slide's called the developmental impact of parenthood. And I've joked before, like getting married changed my life quite a bit, and I thought a lot until I had a kid, and I realized, like, man, the change is it's not even comparable how big of a change it is. All of a sudden, you're not the most important person in your own life, and in a good way. It's like a wall, and sometimes in a stressful way. You need to sleep. You have an important meeting the next morning. It's like your kid that's having a temper tantrum at 3 in the morning doesn't care. It's not that they don't care. You know, like we talked about earlier in the course, they don't have theory of mind developed yet. They're not able to take your perspective. Right? And as we get older and as we become parents and as we start to become aware of how much where we are the support of our family, you know, we see that like when people have kids, the amount of risky behavior that they do tends to decline. You know, whether we're talking about like real extreme risk or whether we're just talking about like I started to drive slower. Marital satisfaction tends to decline and remain low until the kids actually move out, which is a kind of depressing statistic because it's kind of suggesting that even though you might, when you have kids, rate your overall life happiness higher, you might rate your marital relationship happiness lower. And actually, if you think about it, it sort of makes sense because before you had the kid, it's like you and your partner are going out for dinner all the time, you're doing all this kind of stuff, and now you have kids, and a lot of your responsibilities shift to like taking turns with chores or that kind of stuff, kind of co-workers, right? And division of labor can fuel dissatisfaction, meaning just like, you know, I feel like I'm doing too much, or my wife feels like she's doing too much. Support from an extended family can really help. Getting good at having arguments, so the better couples as they get better at communicating and working through arguments and finding ways to get your point across without having to like hit those buttons in your partner that you know how to hit but that don't do anything positive. The better they get at that, the more it increases satisfaction. Single parents notice the drop bigger, which in satisfaction with life. And it's like, it's weird because it's like, oh, single parents like their life less when they have kids. And it's like, well, I think there's a lot you can read into that. Their life gets a lot more complicated and a lot more stressful and a lot more details. Now, again, saying that that doesn't mean you would give up your kid for a second, right? So you can say that you love your kid and it was the best thing that ever happened to you and that it was the most work of anything you've ever done in your life, and those can both be completely true. Here's a depressing stat, having only a 3-year-old that probably won't leave the house for 20 more years, but this is just a very basic graph that on the left axis there, you got the percentage of couples reporting that things between them are going well all the time. First of all, what relationship is going well all the time? Yeah, right. But you see new parents, it's 30-40%. Parents with school-age kids, it's they're being brutally raw honest. It's 10%. It's that's not saying that they're not satisfied with their marriage. It's they're just not saying it's perfect. That's saying 90% are saying it's not perfect is the flip stat. Right, and as kids leave the house, and my face is kind of covering it there, but the point number 8 there says retirement. It's okay, I just gotta, wait till retirement until my happiness is back to my pre-kid level. But again, life is about purpose and meaning, not happiness. Happiness is fool's gold. It's nice to be happy when you're happy, but your character is developed on the bad days by fighting through and staying a person of principle. So, of course, some couples that are together, whether married or not, elect or for whatever reason don't have kids. For couples that are childless, marital fluctuation and marital satisfaction, so how happy they are with their marriage, tends to fluctuate or change less, which would make sense because they're not having this major change like adding a kid to the scene. Women that don't have kids are more likely to have full-time continuous careers, but not necessarily advance more. Again, having more likely to have a full-time career sounds like a benefit, but again, there's the cost piece. Married men who have wives that aren't employed are more likely to advance. Again, at a certain point, this is a task management issue, a workload management issue. Again, this is usually a presentation that has a lot of, since it's so focused on the time of life that's relevant to a lot of the students that I'm teaching at whatever time I'm teaching this. This tends to be an interesting discussion, and with you guys, it's always an interesting discussion. So I'm sure our next Zoom session will have a few hard-hitting questions that I'm already looking forward to. Okay, next slide. Okay, I'll hit this one quick. At this age in life, in our early 20s and 30s, we tend to have friends that are, at least statistically, tend to be relatively similar to us in education and social class and interests and family background. Tend to be roughly from the same age group. Tend to still be mainly same-sex, and I think that's true for me too. Even at this stage of life, I do have some really good quality long-term female friends, but the vast majority of my good friends are definitely still male. And that would be statistically normal. Not that it's not normal if you're not normal, just in the sense of average. Not right or wrong. Yeah, and especially if you're in your 20s, early 20s, late teens and early 20s is probably when you're kind of peaking at amount of friends. Just because then you get busier and you get family stuff and you get work stuff and you keep good friends, but just maybe not as wide of a group. So we see some pretty significant sex differences between men and women friend groups. We've been talking about this throughout this whole course, and you see these differences whether we're talking about 3-year-olds or 30-year-olds. Women tend statistically to have more close friends. Now, again, you're always going to find situations, you're going to find guys with tons of close friends and girls with very few. But this is on average. On average, if you're lining up hundreds of thousands of people, and having them all answer these things on all these things, we would see in general women tend to report having more close friends. They tend to report more emotional intimacy, more self-disclosure, which is just, again, sharing personal stuff, disclosing or making not closed personal stuff, more exchange of emotional support, whereas men tend to remain largely competitive, largely about doing things with each other, going out together, playing sports together, stuff like that. Remember, we're talking primarily 20s, early 30s in this presentation. Early adulthood, we're calling it. As we get older and start to move on from early adulthood into more middle adulthood, an interesting point is that women also tend to play the role of kin keeper. Can you please know this term for the test? So kin is an old word that means family. So a kin keeper would be someone that kind of keeps the family together. And this is actually my wife's mother and my nephew Felix, who my daughter adores, and thinks is like the coolest dude in the world. And yeah, Janet is amazing at doing things that bring us together and kind of keep the family together and help us stay united. And that's a very important role in our society. And maybe this is a word that needs to be a little bit more common of a word, because it really is the glue that holds together a lot of families. And it is a role primarily, at least statistically, primarily occupied by women, and a very important social role. So, again, interesting, kin keeper, people that keep the family together. In my side of the family, that would also be probably my mom and my sister. So again, it's not always like that, but my personal experience reflects the literature on this point. Just a quick follow up to that last point. This is a cool picture of my wife's whole family. Right, so my wife is the one there in yellow pants. Evelyn wasn't born yet. I'm the good-looking guy in the bright green. Watch your eyes. The shirt's loud. And then that's like kind of all of her sisters in the extended family. And when Janet, the one in the middle that was on the last slide, the one in the middle with the green shirt, Julie's mom, when her mom passed, one of the ways she wanted to remember her mom was taking the entire family to this beautiful cottage right on the ocean in Nova Scotia, in Prince Edward Island. You know, that's a pretty ultimate kin keeper move. And you know, it's hard to say like how much a trip like that like kind of cements the relationships within the family and stuff. And it's just an important thing that we sometimes as a society undervalue as core to kind of mental health. People that kind of push to keep people connected. And sometimes it's within families, and sometimes it's within friend groups, and sometimes it's within work teams or sports teams. Okay, just a few slides. A big part of being your age is also work and figuring out what you're going to do with your life work-wise. And family, at least historically, has had probably the biggest factor on what kind of jobs people do when they get older. Occupations tend to be in the same social class as parents. Now, especially historically, that's as little true now as ever. Because of this next point, mainly, like the thing that kind of changes that tide is education. And it's why, you know, education, nothing is for sure, but education is as sure a bet as anything. Family influences choice through value systems, right? Like, so how much the parents are kind of prioritizing school and talking about it as if it's important. Expectations. So in terms of gender and how that affects things, I think as we're moving towards hopefully a situation where gender affects this less and less as a society, it still certainly does. What as a society we sort of consider as male and female jobs, you know, as dated as that kind of language sounds, I think if you ask people and you were just to say like what kind of jobs do you associate with male jobs and female jobs, um, male jobs tend to be more varied, people's responses to that. Female jobs tend to be, even statistically, concentrated in the service industry. A third of all women hold clerical jobs, and a quarter of them are in healthcare, teaching, or domestic services. Okay, so usually very people-facing jobs, which isn't super surprising because in general, females or women tend to score high on, emotional, both enjoying emotional or social situations and performing well in those situations, at least on average. And please bring any questions to our coming up soon. Now, John Holland, pretty interesting dude. Or no, I'll leave that in. I was gonna restart the slide because I called him a dude and I meant to say psychologist. But John Holland is an interesting psychologist because he was looking at this idea of like how personality fits with the type of work you do, and how if you can get that fit right, not only will you like your job more, you'll be better at it, and it'll burn you out less. So, like for example, if I all of a sudden started becoming like some kind of accountant that I was spending my whole day in Excel spreadsheets, my stress level would probably be through the roof. It's not a good match with my personality. I would way rather be doing something like this where I'm like either preferably in person communicating with you and talking about cool ideas, and that kind of fits with my personality. So what Holland's point is that the match between your personality and your job is a highly significant psychological or a highly significant variable in predicting your long-term psychological health and happiness and performance. People whose personality match their jobs are more likely to be satisfied with their work. That's a pretty blunt and direct statement. Right? And he basically breaks it into these 6 different types. Each of us tend to choose and be most successful at an occupation that matches our personality, which makes sense. Now, if you're one of my students and you look at the original PowerPoint that you have for this, you'll see that link where it says link and it's a hyperlink. It'll take you to the actual survey that you can complete and fill out and see how you score in which of these 6 categories you'll score in a bunch of them, but you'll probably have a preference one or maybe 2 that are your high preferences. So if you're wondering what I'm talking about, I'll just show you on the next slide here. And again, if you don't have access to the PowerPoint for whatever reason, you can just Google John Holland personality inventory or something like that, and you'll find it. Right, so he basically said, and I'll just run through this quick, that basically people's preference. So again, he's not saying you either are or you aren't this, but he's saying that people tend to prefer certain things, and if you can get in a situation that kind of matches what you prefer, you're more likely to do good, you're more likely to like it, you're less likely to burn out. So some people are going to like investigative stuff, researching and analyzing and inquiring, and I'd score pretty high on that. Some people are really into realistic stuff like building and repairing and working outdoors. I'd score lower on that, not super low, but lower. A lot of tradespeople would be in that. Some people are really conventional, like accounting, organizing, processing data. I'd score real low on that. Enterprising, selling, managing, persuading, probably in the middle. Social, like helping, instructing and teaching, caregiving, I'd score decently high on that. Artistic, creating and enjoying art, drama, and music, I'd probably again be about in the middle of that. So like just, I haven't done this in a long time, but just having read this to you, I would probably score the highest myself in like investigative and social, with probably in the middle with like artistic and maybe enterprising, and then lowest probably in conventional and realistic. So again, that was a mouthful and I kind of rambled through that, or ranted through that, but I'm just kind of saying this is just another personality typology thing, but it's focused on work. So it's like typology just meaning that there's different types of people, and some types are like this and some types are like that. And so a typology is trying to put people into different type categories. And this is based on work. So there's 6 employment-related personality characteristic types. It's the exact same word as the word type that we use in regular speech all the time. But this is about psychological types. There's different types of people. There's different types of personality matches with employment situations. Okay, a couple more slides just to wrap this up. Supper's model, where he's looking at the stages of career development and basically saying, like, it's interesting because you have to look at how things move through stages. And when you're new to the job, it's like or when you're in the growth stage of your career, let's say, and the exploring stage, you're kind of learning about your abilities. And a lot of you in the program this year, you might tick the boxes of both these, where you're both kind of learning to develop your things like your writing skills and your presenting skills and your research skills and your ability to, critically think in an academic sense. But at the same time, you're also exploring potential careers of what you're going to do with those skills. So a lot of you would be in both kind of in between or branching between both the growth and the exploratory stage, right? Whereas, say maybe a new teacher at the college might be at an establishment stage where they've kind of put in a lot of time, but they're new in establishing themselves in this new role, right? And then there's this long maintenance stage. You could maybe say like me, like, so I've probably been full-time at the college now like 8 years, and hopefully for much longer. But like the idea is that I'm not establishing my career at this point. It's more in a maintenance stage of figuring out what works and kind of keeping going. Okay, so yeah, so he kind of talks about how in his model here, see here it gives some kind of specific age dates. Now, growth, he's kind of putting age, you can kind of tell by his model here that he's kind of talking about the growth stages kind of finishing at high school, basically. But it depends on situational things, and I think the emerging adulthood concept that we started the class with, you could probably add to this model. And this model almost makes sense if you it would, again, a lot of the issues with these models are that they make sense in how they sequence and lay things out. But if you're like, is it really 15 to 24? Or is it like 23 to 36? And like, the actual dates, it's like at a certain point, it's a little bit arbitrary, but although I'm sure they have specific reasons why they picked it. There's a ton of information in this model right here. Right, but he's talking about this like life rainbow, right? Kind of like this course starting with birth and ending with death. Cradle to the grave is what they often call like a developmental psychology course. Stages and ages and cradle to the grave are the two kind of common terms. Okay, job. First of all, let's start with this slide that I always think is hilarious. The toothbrush saying, sometimes I feel like I have the worst job in the world. Toilet paper saying, yeah, right. It's like, again, I don't know, the joke slides come off lame when I'm like presenting by myself. Job satisfaction tends to be lowest mid-career. It tends to feel a bit like the toilet paper in the picture. That's because maybe you've worked hard, now you got a chance, but there's a lot of uncertainty around it. Job security is not a big certainty. The employment market might be unstable. There might be a lack of opportunities. Right, and so this is this early career point, job satisfaction tends to be low. Now, what we're going to see is once we get into middle adulthood and later adulthood, we see a huge increase in job satisfaction in general. So it's low compared to later in adulthood. And that brings us to the end of chapter 14. Thanks for listening. We're clocking in at about an hour 20. Love you guys and hang in there, and we will connect soon. Chapter 16 coming soon. Signing out from the PSYCLab. Yeah, it's not lame. It's actually a cool name. So I'm sticking with it. Cheers.